bleeding into the sand of Coldwater Wash. Maren Holt lay where 3 riders had left her for dead, and the moment she opened her eyes again would change everything the Larkspur Land and Cattle Company thought it owned, including the fact that a quiet stranger named Wade, already watching from the rimrock above, had buried more men than this county had graves. The riders never looked back. They had done what they came to do, and, in their experience, a beaten widow face down in a dry creek bed stayed beaten, stayed quiet, stayed exactly where a man like Silas Marrow needed her to stay until she signed the paper he wanted signed. What none of them knew, riding north toward town with their laughter still hanging in the dust behind them, was that the man on the ridge had drifted into this county that morning for no reason at all and would ride out of it weeks later. Her name was Maren Holt. She was 28 years old, a widow, 11 months now, and it was the second week of September in the year 1883 in Larkspur County, high in the dry grass country of the Wyoming Territory, where a creek's worth of water could be the whole difference between a family's future and a foreclosure. She held, by inheritance from her late husband and by a filing older than any claim the syndicate could produce, the senior water right to Coldwater Creek. 1,100 acres of grazing land downstream depended on what ran through her section first before it ever reached the company's herds. That right was the reason 3 riders had run her down on the road home from the county recorder's office and beaten her within an inch of what a body can survive, and it was the reason the man watching from the rimrock, a drifter who had given his own name in town 3 days earlier as simply Wade, nothing further volunteered, swung down off his horse and started down the slope toward her without knowing whose blood he was walking into, only that it was blood, and that riding on past it was a thing he had stopped being able to do a long time before that particular morning. If stories about the ones who won't look away, the quiet men who show up right when a woman has run clean out of options, are the kind that keep you watching past the hour mark, stay with this one, because what happened in Larkspur County that fall did not end in that wash. It started there. If quiet protectors who refuse to look away are the stories you come back for, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. Now, let's go back 3 weeks to the first letter Silas Marrow sent up to the Holt Ranch house, polite as a church invitation and just as impossible to refuse without a woman paying for it in ways. Isaac Holt had spent 9 years turning 160 scrubby acres along Coldwater Creek into something worth a syndicate's attention, and he had done it the slow way, the honest way, buying up adjoining claims a section at a time as neighbors gave up on the country and moved on. Until the Holt brand ran on 1,100 acres and the water right that fed every one of them sat filed at the county seat under his name and no one else's. He had married Maren the year he turned 30, a quiet courtship built mostly on Sunday suppers, and the particular patience of a man who did not rush things he intended to keep. And in 6 years together they had built the kind of ordinary, unremarkable happiness that never makes the newspapers. A house he'd added a second room onto the spring before he died, meaning it for children that hadn't come yet, but that he brought up. In the evenings, like a settled fact rather than a hope. He had ridden out one October morning to check vents along Bitter Ridge and never ridden back, and it was Gid Farrow, the Holt's nearest neighbor and the closest thing Isaac had to a brother in that county, who found him 3 days later at the bottom of the ridge trail with his horse grazing loose a quarter-mile off, and his neck broken in a way Sheriff Tobias Lund pronounced, without much looking, Maren had grieved the way a person grieves work they can't stop doing, because 1,100 acres and 40 head of cattle do not pause for a widow's mourning. And by the spring after Isaac's death she had learned to run branding, Dr. Screwworm, and with Gid Farrow riding over most weeks to help where an extra pair of hands mattered, and a hired man named Ezra Combs staying on through calving season, because Isaac had always paid him fair, and Ezra saw no reason that should change with the boss dead. It was hard country and a harder year, but it was hers, clean and clear, until the letters started coming that summer from a company nobody in Larkspur had heard much of before, the Larkspur Land and Cattle Company, newly capitalized out of Cheyenne with money that everyone understood, traced back further east than that. Silas Marrow arrived in town that June to open a company office above the bank, a lean, soft-spoken man in his 40s, who dressed better than anyone else in 3 counties and had a gift, widely known throughout that summer, for making even the hardest proposition. He rode out to see Maren himself that first visit, hat in hand, coffee accepted and complimented, and laid out the company's interest plainly enough. They intended to run 12,000 head across the Coldwater Range inside 3 years. And a spread that size needed water rights a good deal more senior and more secure than whatever piecemeal arrangements the smaller outfits currently held among themselves. He put forward $1,100 for the Holt place, land and water right together, a sum that made Ezra Combs whistle low when he heard the figure passed around the bunkhouse that evening, and Marrow made the whole proposal with every appearance of expecting a grateful and immediate yes. Maren refused him, and refused him gently, because Isaac had built that place with his own 2 hands, and she had no intention of letting a stranger's checkbook undo 9 years of work inside a single afternoon. Marrow took the refusal with a smile that did not move much past his mouth, thanked her for her time, and rode back to town, and for 2 weeks nothing happened at all, which Maren, in hindsight, came to understand was its own kind of message, the company studying her, working out exactly how much pressure a widow alone could absorb. The pressure began small, and built the way bad weather builds, one uncomfortable sign stacking onto the last, until a person looks up one day and realizes the whole sky has changed color without her quite noticing the moment it happened. A fence line along the eastern boundary turned up, cut in 4 places inside a single week. Cattle scattered into company range, where a Larkspur foreman charged Maren a trespass fee to get them back, polite as you please, citing a company policy nobody in the county had ever heard of before that summer. Her well water ran cloudy for 3 days running in July, and though nobody could prove a thing, Ezra Combs found boot prints near the wellhead that matched no boot on the Holt place, and Gid Farrow found the same prints a week later near his own stock tank a half-mile downstream, which made plain enough to them both that the message wasn't meant for Maren alone. It was meant for anyone in the county still weighing whether to stand with her. The county gathered for its harvest social that August in the same Methodist hall it always used, an occasion small enough most years to draw the whole population of Larkspur and its outlying ranches under one roof, and it was there that the pressure on Maren stopped being a private, whispered matter and became something the whole county had to decide how to carry. Marrow attended himself, gracious and well-dressed, buying cider for the children, and shaking hands with the same easy warmth he'd shown at the Holt kitchen table, and a handful of the smaller ranchers who owed the bank money, careful and a little ashamed of the drifting even as they did it. Gid Farrow made a point loud enough to carry of sitting with Maren the whole evening and steering every conversation that came near her toward ordinary weather and ordinary crops, a small deliberate kindness that cost him, he learned later, 2 separate offers of easier credit terms from men currently sitting on Marrow's payroll. Not every neighbor found that same courage. Pruitt Ostrander, who ran 300 head on land bordering the Holt place and owed the bank for a bull he'd bought the spring before, crossed the hall twice that evening to speak with Marrow directly, and crossed it not once to speak with Maren. Understanding by then exactly what a banknote could cost a man's spine when the note came due at the wrong season. The town itself, meanwhile, had gone quiet in a way that needed no explaining twice. Otis Prager, who ran the Larkspur Trust and held the note on half the ranches in the county, had accepted a directorship on the new company's local board that summer, along with, it was generally understood, a sum of money nobody discussed above a murmur, and afterward loans that had once come easy to Maren's neighbors began requiring a second look. I note that the bank's position had grown more cautious of late. Sheriff Tobias Lund, a decent enough man by nature but not a brave one, had taken to answering Maren's reports of cut fences and fouled wells with a slow shake of his head and a promise to look into it that arrived. Because Lund's own re-election depended on votes the company's payroll workers now supplied in numbers no local sheriff could easily ignore. Cora Lindquist, who ran the county's one small newspaper out of a shop front 2 doors down from the bank, printed one cautious editorial that summer questioning the company's methods, and found her advertising dry up so fast the following month that she never printed a second one. Every scrap of the notes and letters that anyone in the county troubled to bring her. If quiet protectors who refuse to look away are the stories you come back for, this next stretch is exactly why. Because it was into a county gone as quiet, this frightened of one company's money, that a stranger nobody recognized rode in that August with a first name freely given and a whole history behind it that not a single soul in Larkspur guessed at. Wade rode into town 3 days before the ambush in Coldwater Wash, a lean, sun-worn man somewhere north of 30, who kept mostly to himself at the livery and took a meal or two at the hotel dining room. Being a town that saw its share of drifters passing through toward the railroad camps further west, thought little enough of him at first. Hattie Kern, who ran the hotel dining room and prided herself on reading a stranger's whole life story out of how he handled his fork and his silence, told Ezra Combs weeks afterward that she'd pegged the newcomer as trouble the very first evening, though not the ordinary kind of trouble a small town usually worried over. That a place only recognized once it had already arrived and settled in among the regular customers, quiet as Sunday. He had the kind of stillness that some men wear like armor and other men wear because there simply isn't much left inside them worth putting into words. And it was hard, watching him from across a dining room or a livery yard. He put a few careful questions to Emmett Rourke, the town's aging blacksmith and former deputy, about grazing land and water rights in the area, the kind of questions any drifter weighing whether to settle somewhere might raise. And Rourke, who had ridden with rougher company than most Larkspur folks ever guessed, back in his own younger years, noticed something in the stranger's manner he couldn't quite name yet, but filed away anyway, the particular economy of a man who never wasted emotion he didn't need. Wade had in truth drifted into Larkspur County for no reason grander than any other stop along a long, aimless year of riding. No job waiting, no kin expecting him, nothing behind him but a history he had stopped discussing with anyone, including himself, some years before. He had heard over a meal at the hotel 2 ranch hands from a small neighboring outfit grumbling low about a widow out on Coldwater Creek getting squeezed by a land company nobody could quite stand up to, and he had listened without comment the way a man listens to 100 other towns' troubles that aren't his business. and might have ridden on the very next morning without another thought about it, if the road out of town hadn't happened to run past the mouth of Coldwater Wash at almost the exact hour 3 riders finished what they'd come to do. The morning of the ambush, Maren had ridden into town alone, against Ezra Combs's quiet objection to file a formal notice of her water right at the county recorder's office, a precaution her attorney in Cheyenne had recommended by letter weeks before, making the claim harder to contest in any court the syndicate might eventually try. She had let no one but Gid Farrow and Ezra know the specific hour she meant to ride, a small caution that had felt, at the time, like ordinary sense rather than fear, though it did her little good in the end, because Otis Prager's bank clerk had a habit of mentioning the day's county office business to Marrow's office over the noon hour, a habit that had made him a quietly useful man to the company all summer without either of them ever naming it what it was. A folded note had waited for her on the porch rail 2 mornings earlier, unsigned, its single line reading that the company's patience with stubborn women ran shorter than she seemed to believe, and Maren had burned it in the stove without mentioning it to anyone. Hauling herself the recorder's office and the paper trail behind it would matter more, in the end, than any anonymous man's threats. Cutter Boyle led the 3 riders who waited for her at Coldwater Wash on the road home, a broad, sun-blistered man Marrow had brought up from Cheyenne specifically for work of this exact kind, along with 2 hired hands named Dobbs and Skoll, who did whatever Boyle wanted done without raising many questions about why. They came down out of the scrub oak on either side of the trail with their bandanas already up. Boxing her horse before she'd fully registered 3 men had appeared at all, and Boyle's instructions from Marrow had been careful and specific. Frighten her badly enough, because a dead widow drew federal marshals in a way a merely terrified one never would. What Boyle delivered instead ran considerably past frightened. He dragged Maren down off her spooked horse by the arm hard enough to dislocate her shoulder, and when she fought him, clawing, kicking, getting one good boot heel into Dobbs's kneecap before Skoll pinned her arms, Boyle's temper, never patient to begin with, he struck her twice across the face with an open hand, hard enough to split her lip. And, when she still would not go quiet and reasonable the way frightened women in his experience generally did, he threw her down into the dry wash and let his boots finish what his hands had started. Not out of loyalty exactly, but out of the particular cowardice of men who have decided a thing has already gone too far to interrupt. Your company man wants his answer yes, now, Boyle informed her once. She'd gone still, crouching close enough that she could smell the whiskey on him, even through the ringing in her own skull, or next time there won't be enough of you left to change your mind twice. They rode off north toward town, laughing about nothing in particular, the loose, ugly laughter of men working off a bad morning's tension, and left her exactly where the cold open of this story found her, bleeding into the sand of a dry wash, and utterly unaware that the stranger who'd overheard 2 ranch hands grumbling about her troubles the night before had happened to be riding the very road home that carried him past the mouth of that same wash within minutes of the riders clearing out. Wade heard her before he saw her, a low, ragged sound that wasn't quite crying, more the sound a body makes when it's trying very hard not to make any sound at all, and he was off his horse and down the wash bank before he'd fully decided to be, the old instinct moving his feet a full 2 seconds ahead of any conscious thought about who she was or what he owed her. He found her curled on her side in the sand, one eye swollen nearly shut, her lip split and her shoulder sitting wrong in its socket, blood matting dark into hair that had come loose from its pin sometime during whatever had happened to her. practiced hands of a man who had done this exact grim inventory more times than he cared to count whether anything inside her had broken worse than what showed on the outside. "Easy," he murmured, the only soft word he allowed himself that whole grim minute when her good eye finally focused enough to register a stranger crouched over her and her whole body flinched hard enough to hurt itself worse. "I'm not one of them. Whoever did this rode off north a while back. You're safe now, far as I can make you." He let the introductions wait, because a badly hurt person rarely has the strength to spare for names, and what she needed in that first minute was a voice steady enough to trust and a pair of hands careful enough not to add to the damage. He set her shoulder back into its socket with one clean, practiced motion that made her cry out once, sharp and short, before the relief of it hit, and the worst of the pain in that particular joint. He bound her ribs as best he could, with strips torn from his own shirt, checked her pupils for the slow, uneven look of a serious head injury, and found them, thankfully, even enough to trust. And then he lifted her carefully the way a man lifts something he's decided matters, and rode the 6 miles to the Holt ranch house at a pace slow enough not to jar her further, and fast enough to have her indoors before the shock, wearing off, could turn into something worse. Ezra Combs saw them coming from a quarter-mile off and had the door open and Gid Farrow's name half-cried across the yard before Wade had even swung down, and the next several hours passed in the particular blur of a household thrown suddenly into crisis, water boiled. Gid Farrow, riding hard for the nearest doctor in the next county, over because nobody in that yard trusted Sheriff Lund's cousin, the Larkspur town doctor, not to carry every detail straight back to Otis Prager's bank inside the hour. Wade stayed through all of it without anyone needing to invite him to, and without much explanation for why a total stranger felt entitled to stay moving through the ranch house. Who first put into words out loud what several of them had already started to wonder, that this drifter moved through a crisis like a man who had seen a great many worse ones. Maren woke fully near midnight to find the stranger from the wash sitting on an upturned crate just outside her bedroom door, not asleep, not doing much of anything except watching the dark yard through the front window, with the patient, unhurried attention of a man keeping a genuine watch rather than merely passing time. And something about the sight of him there, a total stranger, uninvited, simply refusing to leave until he was satisfied the danger had passed, steadied something in her that 3 weeks of Marrow's letters and Boyle's fists had come very close to breaking entirely. "You didn't have to stay," she managed the next morning, once she could sit up enough to hold a full sentence together, her voice rough and her face a ruin of bruising she hadn't yet seen in a mirror and didn't much want to. "No," he agreed, and let that single word sit a long moment before adding anything past it, the kind of silence that in another man might have felt evasive but in him felt more like a person choosing his words with real care rather than withholding them. Figured somebody ought to, though, and there wasn't anybody else standing in that wash. He wanted to know plainly who had done it and why, and Maren, exhausted past the point of caution, gave him the whole of it. Marrow's offer, the cut fences, the fouled well, Boyle's message about a signature the company expected, and watched something behind the stranger's eyes go very still, though nothing in his face showed her anything she could have named as anger, not yet. Word of the attack reached town by that afternoon, carried in by Gid Farrow's trip for the doctor, and it reached Silas Marrow's office above the bank within the hour, delivered by a clerk who had until that moment believed the whole business would end in a quiet signature. Merrill's reaction, when Boyle reported in that evening exactly what had happened at Coldwater Wash, was not gratitude but a cold, controlled fury of the kind that made even Boyle, a man not easily rattled, take an involuntary step backward. "I wanted her frightened," Marrow bit off, quiet enough that a passer-by outside his office window would have caught nothing at all. Not crippled, and not the talk of every corner in this county by supper time. "You've handed her sympathy. I'll spend a month buying back, if I can buy it back at all." He sent Boyle out of the office with instructions to keep his crew away from the Holt place entirely, until further notice, and spent that evening working out, with the careful patience that had built his whole career. What Marrow did not yet know, and would not learn for nearly 2 weeks, was that the widow he'd meant to frighten into a signature now had a stranger sleeping in her barn who checked the tree line every evening at dusk with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had once made a whole living out of exactly that habit, and who had quietly begun, without ever announcing it as a decision, to treat Maren Holt's troubles as very much his own business after all. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them named out loud, but both understood plainly enough. Wade stayed on, ostensibly as hired help. He mended the cut fence line along the eastern boundary inside 2 days working alone, doctored a screwworm outbreak in the herd with a competence that surprised even Ezra Combs, and split enough firewood before the first cold snap to see the household through most of the winter. Maren included, understood the fence mending, and wood splitting were the visible surface of a much simpler arrangement. He was standing guard, plainly and without apology, and the company's riders, who had grown used all summer to a ranch defended by nothing sturdier than an aging hired hand and a widow's stubbornness, found themselves for the first time riding past a place that watched them back. The first real test of that new arrangement came not from Boyle's crew directly, but from a quieter attempt, 10 days after the beating, when a Larkspur land and cattle rider Maren had never seen before, rode out under cover of a delivery excuse to salt the stretch of the upper pasture where her cattle grazed thickest. Deniable kind of cruelty, meant to sicken the herd over weeks rather than all at once, the sort of damage that could always be blamed on bad luck or a poisoned spring rather than any company's deliberate hand. Wade caught him before he'd finished half the job, having taken to riding the fence lines himself most mornings before the household was properly awake, and rather than the violence the rider clearly braced, for Wade simply relieved him of the salt sacks, walked his horse back to the county road, on foot beside him for the better part of a mile, and sent him back to town with nothing worse than a long, silent escort and the unmistakable understanding that the ranch's edges were being watched now closely by someone who noticed everything and forgave nothing. Marrow heard the account from his own embarrassed rider by that evening and understood it for exactly what it was. Not mercy, but a demonstration. Message returned in the same quiet coin. Silas Marrow tested the new arrangement carefully after that, the way a man tests ice before committing his full weight to it. He sent 2 riders past the Holt boundary the following week, ostensibly checking a stray heifer that had wandered onto company range, and found Wade waiting at the fence line before they'd covered a 1/4 mile of Holt land, unarmed in any visible sense, simply present, with a stillness about him that made both riders turn back toward their own range a good deal sooner than the stray heifer strictly required. He tried Cutter Boyle himself the following week, sending the foreman into town with instructions to find the drifter at the hotel dining room and take his measure directly, man to man. And Boyle came back from that supper describing to Marrow with visible unease. A conversation that had left him knowing considerably less than he'd hoped and feeling considerably more rattled than he cared to admit. Boyle found Wade eating alone that evening and sat down across from him uninvited, the way a man sits down when he means to be seen doing it, and put it to him straight what his business was, staying on at the Holt place when word around town had him passing through. Wade set his fork down without any particular hurry and looked at Boyle for a long moment before answering, an appraisal so calm and so thorough that Boyle, who had spent that morning's ambush enjoying every advantage of numbers and surprise, found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to think about, genuinely unsettled by a man sitting perfectly still across a dinner table with both hands visible and empty. Widow, needed, fence mended, and a hand who wouldn't run off scared. The first time trouble showed up, Wade returned even and unhurried. Seemed like honest work. You got a particular interest in my business, or is this just how your company introduces itself to new hires? He held Boyle's stare without any obvious effort, and it was Boyle in the end who broke off the look first, muttering something about keeping his nose clean and pushing back from the table a good deal faster than he'd sat down at it, and word of that exchange. The quiet drifter, who hadn't so much as raised his voice, and had still somehow sent Cutter Boyle out of the hotel, looking rattled, spread through Larkspur's smaller ranches within a day, the kind of small local legend that grows a little larger with each retelling. It was Emmett Rourke, the town blacksmith, who first put a real name and a real history to the stranger. Everyone else was still calling, simply Wade. Rourke had spent 11 years, long before Larkspur, riding as a deputy attached to a territorial marshal's office out of Cheyenne, and in that service he had crossed paths twice and briefly. A man who had broken the Powder Basin land war 8 years before by the simple, brutal expedient of outlasting and outgunning every hired crew 3 competing syndicates threw at him. That detective's name in the handful of newspaper accounts that had ever run it, and the considerably larger number of campfire stories that hadn't bothered with accuracy, was Wade Calder, and Rourke, watching the stranger shoe a horse at his forge one afternoon, found himself nearly certain he was looking at the same man, aged 8 years, quieter and considerably more careful about his own name. Rourke did not confront him directly, not at first. He mentioned it instead, carefully and only once, to Cora Lindfist at the newspaper office, a woman he trusted to weigh information rather than spread it. And Cora, who had spent that whole difficult summer watching her own small paper go quiet under Otis Prager's pressure, careful attention of a person who has just been handed something that might eventually matter a very great deal. She spent 2 evenings after that going through the paper's own back issues and a small stack of territorial gazettes she kept for reference, and found in a 5-year-old Cheyenne paper, folded thin at its creases, a single short column describing the closing weeks of the Powder Basin land to an independent range detective named Wade Calder, whose methods the article declined to describe in detail, and whose current whereabouts, the piece noted at its close, remained unknown even to the syndicates who had once employed and later feared him. It reached Silas Marrow roughly a week later, through a considerably less careful channel, a telegraph inquiry the company's Denver principals had sent weeks earlier and unrelated at first, asking after rumors of a range detective working independently somewhere in the Northern Territories to break exactly this kind of syndicate land grab in 3 separate counties before Marrow had ever taken his current post. When a description came back from Cheyenne matching closely enough to trouble him, the drifter currently mending fence at the Holt place Marrow sat with that telegram a long while in his office above the bank, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man recalculating an entire campaign, that he had very badly misjudged exactly what kind of trouble had ridden into his county 3 weeks before. Members of this channel get these frontier stories first. If that's worth something to you, tap join beside the channel name and become a member today. Maren learned the truth from Wade himself, not from town gossip, on an evening in early October when the first real cold of the season had settled over the ranch, and the two of them sat on the porch steps after supper the way they'd fallen into doing most evenings by then. She had heard, by that point, the murmured version circulating through Larkspur. The drifter was some kind of famous gun for hire. Some claimed an outlaw, others a lawman, nobody quite agreeing on which. He gave her the whole of it plainly, without drama and without the practiced modesty men sometimes use to make a hard history sound smaller than it was. He had ridden as a range detective for the better part of 6 years, hired independently by smaller ranchers and occasionally by territorial courts to counter exactly the kind of land pressure Marrow's company was applying now. Every one of them in a fight he hadn't started and couldn't honestly claim he regretted finishing. He had walked away from the work 3 years before Larkspur, not from any change of conscience about the men he'd stopped, but from a slow accumulation of tired that had finally outweighed whatever satisfaction the work had once given him, taking honest work where he found it and moving on before anyone in any one place learned enough about him to raise the questions Maren was raising now. "I didn't come here looking for this," he confided, watching the dark tree line rather than her face, the way a man discusses something that still costs him something to put into words. Wasn't hunting a fight, wasn't hunting a syndicate to break. Just heard two hands talking about a widow in trouble, and happened to ride the road that carried me past her the next morning. But I've been doing the arithmetic on this county for 3 weeks now, and I don't much like where it comes out if I ride on and leave you standing alone against what's coming next." What is coming next? She wanted to know, and there was no fear in the question by then, only the flat, exhausted directness of a woman who had run out of patience for anything less than a plain answer. "Marrow knows who I am now, or close enough to it," Wade returned. "Man like that doesn't back down from a name. He either buys it off or he throws everything he's got at it before it costs him more than he can afford. Given what Boyle already showed us he's willing to do, I expect it'll be the second one." He turned to look at her then, and whatever else lived behind his usual quiet showed through plainly for the first time since she'd known him. "I'm asking you plain, because you've earned a plain answer after everything this summer's cost you. You want me gone before that comes. I'll ride out tonight and you'll never see me again. Or you want me standing in this yard when it does come, and I'll be honest with you now, it likely won't be a quiet ending, either way it goes." Maren did not answer him right away. She sat with the question a long moment, looking out at the same dark tree line he'd been watching, at the ranch her husband had built and she had held onto through a summer that had tried every way it knew how to take it from her, and when she finally put her answer into words, her voice had steadied into something that hadn't been there since the morning Boyle left her bleeding in that wash. "Isaac built this place believing a man could hold what was his if he worked hard enough and stayed honest enough," she began. "I buried him 11 months ago and spent this whole summer finding out that isn't true, not against men like Marrow, not without something more than hard work standing behind it. I'm not asking you to fight my war for me. but I've had enough of running from this county's fear to add my own on top of it. Stay, if staying is a thing you're choosing and not a thing you feel you owe me. I'd rather face what's coming with my eyes open than spend one more season pretending it isn't coming at all. And if it comes to a fight in that yard, I'll be standing in it too, not hiding behind the kitchen door waiting to hear how it ended. It was, in its own quiet way, the truest kind of answer either of them could have given. And Wade nodded once, the small, unhurried nod of a man settling a decision he'd already half made before he ever raised the question. Silas Marrow spent the following 2 weeks doing exactly the arithmetic Wade had predicted he would, weighing a buyout figure nearly double his original one against the far uglier alternative Boyle kept pressing him toward, and it was in the end a second telegram from the company's Denver principals, demanding the Coldwater water right secured before winter closed the passes and delayed the whole expansion another full season, that tipped his calculation toward the ugly alternative. He summoned Boyle to his office on the last Thursday of October and gave him instructions considerably blunter than anything he'd allowed himself to voice out loud before that point. Ride out to the Holt place with every man the company could spare, remove the drifter by whatever means the drifter's own conduct required, and see to it that Maren Holt signed the water right over before that night was finished, one way or the other. Boyle rode out from town the following evening with 9 men behind him, more than double the crew he'd led into Coldwater Wash a month before, because whatever else Boyle had come to believe about the quiet stranger occupying the Holt place, and a man who did not underestimate his opponent brought numbers instead of confidence. They came in under cover of full dark, meaning to catch the ranch asleep and unprepared, and might well have managed exactly that against most outfits in the county, except that Wade had spent every one of the preceding 3 weeks preparing for precisely this night, and the Holt ranch that greeted Boyle's riders was very far from unprepared. Kid Farrow had ridden over that same evening on Wade's quiet request, bringing with him 2 hired hands from his own outfit, and a shotgun that had mostly gathered dust since his own younger days, and Ezra Combs had spent the afternoon at Wade's direction, positioning lanterns and cover around the yard in a pattern that gave the ranch house every advantage a defended position could offer against a mounted crew riding in, expecting an easy surprise. Cora Lindfist, informed by Emmett Rourke, earlier that same day that trouble looked close to breaking, had ridden out herself against every sensible instinct of self-preservation. Maren herself stood at the porch rail with Isaac's old rifle held steady in both hands, her bruises long since faded to yellow-green shadows under her collar, but the memory of that wash still close enough to keep her hands from shaking, close enough, if anything, to keep them perfectly still. Boyle's riders came up the ranch road at a hard trot and found, instead of a sleeping house, lantern light burning steady in every window and a single figure standing calm and unhurried in the middle of the yard, rifle held loose and easy in both hands, waiting for them with the particular stillness of a man who had done this exact kind of waiting more times than any of the riders bearing down on him had lived years. "That's far enough," Wade called, his voice carrying clean across the yard without needing to be raised much at all, and something in the flat certainty of it was enough to pull the lead riders up short several yards further back than Boyle had planned. "You're one man." Calder Boyle had learned the name by then, and used it deliberately, testing whether the reputation held up better than the man standing in front of him. "I've got 9 riding with me tonight. However many men you buried in Powder Basin, you buried them 1 crew at a time, not 9 at once. You'd be surprised how little that numbers ever mattered, Wade returned. And there was no bravado in it, only the plain, exhausted certainty of a man stating an arithmetic he'd worked out a long time before that night. And it isn't 9, Boyle. Look behind me. Beside the porch rail, Maren's rifle caught the lantern light, steady in her hands, and Gid Farrell's shotgun showed itself at the barn loft window a heartbeat later, and 2 more shapes eased into view along the corral fence where Ezra Combs and one of Farrell's hired hands had waited quiet in the dark the whole while. You don't have to find out how this ends tonight. Marrow sent you to finish a job he started with a beating and a dry wash, and I expect at least half the men behind you signed on for cattle work, not for riding down a woman in her own yard. Any man wants to turn around right now and ride back to town. I'll not put a bullet in his back for the choosing. It was, Cora Lindquist would set down later, in the account that finally ran in the Larkspur Sentinel once the company's grip on her advertising had broken entirely, the offer more than the threat that turned the night, because 2 of Boyle's 9 riders, men who had joined the crew for honest wages and found themselves increasingly uneasy about exactly what those wages were buying, peeled quietly away from the group and rode back toward town without another word, and their going seemed to loosen something in the resolve of the men who stayed. Boyle, watching his numbers shrink in real time, and his own nerve fraying faster than he wanted Marrow ever to hear about, made the decision that ended the standoff the only way a man like him generally knew how to end anything. He went for his gun. He was not, in the end, close to fast enough. Wade's shot took him high in the shoulder before Boyle's own pistol had cleared its holster more than halfway, spinning him hard off his saddle into the dust of the yard he'd ridden in, meaning to burn, and the remaining riders, watching their leader go down inside a single heartbeat against a man they'd been assured was only one, found their own appetite for the fight had gone with him. Gid Farrow's shotgun blast over their heads from the barn loft, more warning than attack, finished what Boyle's fall had started, and the last of the riders wheeled and rode for town at a dead gallop, leaving Boyle down in the yard bleeding, disarmed, and once Ezra Combs had bound the wound well enough to keep him breathing. Very much available to answer for exactly what had happened in Coldwater Wash a month before, and exactly whose instructions had put him there. Woodcutter Boyle gave up to Sheriff Tobias Lund the following morning, once the pain and the fear of hanging had loosened a tongue that had stayed carefully closed all summer, went a good deal further than the ambush alone. He named Silas Marrow directly as the man who'd ordered the beating, and, in the particular desperate hope of a man trying to trade information for leniency, he handed over something none of them had expected to hear that morning at all, that Isaac Holt's death 11 months before had not been the riding accident. But Boyle's own crew's earlier work, back before Marrow had settled on Boyle as his permanent foreman, staged along Bitter Ridge to frighten a stubborn rancher into selling before the company decided, in that first uncertain year, the confession changed everything. A beaten sheriff's easy indifference had allowed to stand unquestioned for 11 months. Lund, faced with a signed statement, a wounded prisoner, and a newspaper editor who had personally witnessed enough of the previous night's events to make any cover-up considerably more dangerous than simply doing his job, rode into town that same afternoon and arrested Silas Marrow in his own office above the bank. In front of a crowd of onlookers that Cora Lindquist's account, printed 2 days later under a headline the whole county was still discussing weeks afterward, made sure had grown considerably larger than it might otherwise have been. Marrow's Denver principals informed by telegraph of their local agent's arrest, and the newspaper account already circulating well beyond Larkspur County's borders, moved with the particular speed of investors protecting capital, withdrew the company's remaining offers on every contested water right in the county, and quietly shelved the whole Coldwater expansion rather than risk the scrutiny a murder trial would bring down on considerably larger interests further east. Otis Prager, whose directorship had suddenly become a considerable liability rather than an asset, resigned his position at the Larkspur Trust before the month was out, and the loans that had grown so cautious over the summer found their way back to something like their old easy terms almost overnight. Once the pressure that had made them cautious simply evaporated. Pruitt Ostrander, who had crossed the Methodist Hall twice that August to court Marrow's favor, crossed the same hall a month later to shake Gid Farrow's hand and apologize, a small awkward gesture that Gid accepted without much ceremony. Maren Holt kept her ranch, kept her senior water right to Coldwater Creek clear and uncontested at last, and stood that November at Isaac's grave, for the first time since the spring, able to tell him honestly, not because the law had protected her, though it finally had, and not because the town had stood with her from the start, though most of it eventually had, but because a stranger who owed her nothing had happened to ride the right road on the right morning. That, riding on past her trouble, was a thing he could no longer bring himself to do. Wade stayed through that winter and into the spring that followed, mending what needed mending around a ranch that had for the first time in nearly a year no larger danger left to guard against, and if the town of Larkspur eventually stopped calling him simply the drifter, the phrase Maren Holt's man, neither of them ever bothered correcting the description, because by then it had become, in every way that mattered to either one of them, exactly true. He never did go back to the work that had once made his name feared across 3 territories, and he never fully explained even to Maren all 11 of the reasons he'd finally walked away from it. Some things a man keeps, she came to understand, not out of secrecy but simply because certain weights are easier carried alone, even by a man who has, at long last, stopped needing to carry everything else alone too. Gid Farrow took to stopping by most Sundays whether there was fence to mend or not, and Cora Lindfist's newspaper, its advertising fully restored once the county understood exactly which side had been worth standing on, ran a full accounting, the kind of story that got read aloud at the mercantile counter for a month afterward, and never once needed exaggerating to hold a room's attention. Cutter Boyle stood trial the following spring in the county seat once his shoulder had mended enough to sit upright through the proceedings, and the same testimony that had freed Maren of Marrow's grip put Boyle himself behind bars for a term of years the territorial judge saw no reason to shorten, given the particulars of a beating that half the county had by then heard described in exact and ugly detail. Silas Marrow never stood trial at all. In the end, his attorney, paid for by whatever remained of the Denver principal's goodwill, negotiated a quiet settlement that traded a confession to lesser charges, resolution that left more than a few of Maren's neighbors unsatisfied, but that Sheriff Lund, newly determined to prove himself worth his badge after a long season of looking the other way, considered the surest way to close the matter. Dobbs and Skull, the 2 riders who'd held Maren down in the wash while Boyle did the worst of it, were run out of the territory entirely by a county that had lost all patience for company men once the true shape of that August had come fully into the light, and neither one was ever heard from again in that part of Wyoming. Ezra Combs stayed on at the Holt place through every season that followed, and it was Ezra, more than anyone, who liked to tell newer hands the story of the morning A stranger rode in from nowhere carrying a woman half dead across his saddle. Though he always finished the telling the same careful way, not with the gunfight in the yard, which was the part strangers passing through always wanted most, but with the quieter fact that the man had stayed on afterward, through a whole hard winter, mending fence nobody was paying him to mend, had he Kearns red on him, offered that very first week at the hotel, made its way back to Maren eventually, second-hand and much retold, and Maren found she agreed with it more than she disagreed, that the town had recognized something true in him before it had a single fact to hang the recognition on. The particular, unmistakable weight of a man who had already decided, long before Larkspur ever tested him, exactly what kind of trouble he was willing to carry for someone else's sake. The wash where they'd left her for dead ran full and easy, that following spring, carrying its share down to every smaller outfit downstream the way it always should have. And Larkspur County told the story of that fall for years afterward the way small counties tell the stories that mattered to them most, a little differently in every retelling, the numbers of Boyle's riders growing or shrinking depending on who carried it that particular evening, but the ending always landing in the same place, regardless that a widow they'd all been too frightened to stand beside had stood anyway, and a stranger with no name worth speaking had turned out, when the county needed exactly that, to have carried one worth remembering after all.